The following is a two-part conversation with Dr. Robin Carhart-Harris, a world-renowned neuroscientist and psychologist specializing in the field of psychedelics and particularly psychedelic therapy to treat mental health disorders such as depression, anorexia, anxiety, PTSD, OCD, etc. We talk about all those things in the two parts of our conversation. The first part, we hone in on the political landscape of psychedelics and how they have culturally, politically and historically evolved over time in the public eye. And Robin talks at length about past NIH failures in funding psychedelic therapy. And we discuss the role of big pharma and the failures of the current and past existing psychiatric establishment in treating mental health using reductionistic neurochemical explanations of lack of serotonin and prescribing SSRIs. We talk about how psychedelics are a unique departure from that reductionistic perspective. We talk about the interconnectedness of biology, psychology, and sociology, and how mental health should not be viewed in a vacuum as either purely psychological, biological, or neurological, or sociological, and how we must have a holistic approach to mental health. We also talk about the excitement and hopes for the new health administration in the United States with Jay Bhattacharya, former co-host of this podcast at the NIH, RFK Jr. at the HHS, and Marty McCary at the FDA. The second part of the conversation, we talk about Robin's particular unique work in brain imaging studies for psychedelic therapy. We talk about his entropic brain hypothesis, about how people in mental illness, such as addiction and depression, have a high level of orderliness to their toxic pathological mental patterns. Thoughts like, I'm unworthy, I don't deserve love, I can't find love in life, it's hard to make friends, I need this addiction to survive, etc., etc. We talk about how psychedelics can add entropy and shake up rigid thought patterns, such as the aforementioned ones. And we go deep into his theories around the relaxed beliefs under psychedelics, how through the entropy, people often experience a relaxation of their rigid thought patterns and an ability to learn new ways of approaching self and world and others. We talk about the efficacy for depression and anorexia, the ability to change beliefs. And we talk about the therapeutic potential of psychedelics at great length. All around, it was a fascinating conversation about psychedelic therapy and its future in our society. We also talk about free will and determinism and how psychedelics seem to enhance free will and agency so that people can actually take more ownership of their life and make better decisions and be more responsible adults and contribute to society. We also talk about Robin's work on the default mode network, the known as the ego center of the brain, and how he's changed his opinions on that as he's done more studies on this, and how psychedelics relate to ego dissolution and dysregulation of the default mode network as opposed to lowered activity, which was the previous kind of consensus. So we talked at length about all those things. It was a fascinating conversation. I hope you enjoy it. But before we get there, a couple of notes here from our wonderful sponsors. First of all, Alchemy Elements, a wonderful adaptogenic mushroom blend featuring adaptogens, which are compounds known to increase resilience in the nervous system and respond to stress. Things like reishi, cordyceps mushrooms, lion's mane mushrooms, shilajit, and more. Everything is third-party lab tested in Alchemy Elements, and I felt the difference in more awakeness, alertness, and energy throughout the day. You can use the code ILLUSION at the checkout and you'll save 10% on a one-time order or 30% off your first subscription order, which comes with a beautiful ritual kit, a gold bottle, a gold spoon, and a gold handheld frother to mix it perfectly every time. I highly recommend using Alchemy Elements. Again, use code ILLUSION at checkout. We'll leave all that information below. Secondly, a word from our sponsor, Trinergy Health, founded by Dr. Aruna Tamla, who's been on the podcast multiple times. We'll be back for a wonderful reader Q&A. The reality is, as discussed in this podcast with Dr. Robin Carhart-Harris, that mainstream psychiatry has failed us for many decades in providing real holistic solutions to mental health problems. psychiatric meds are often neither safe nor effective. So we need to find new solutions. Trinergy Health offers a holistic model to treating mental health. Aruna has founded and pioneered this wonderful holistic 6-month program for mind-body recovery and wellness. And it's based on her foundational framework of diet, trauma, and toxins, which we've talked about in previous podcasts with her. Dr. Aruna and her team help each client address their specific root causes to find vitality, health, and harmony. Using this approach, many clients have healed from so-called incurable mind-body issues that other doctors have failed to address. So I highly recommend it. You can schedule an intake appointment for free at the link below, or you can call at the number below. We'll leave that in the description. And you can use code RAV10 to get 10% discount on Dr. Aruna's holistic psychiatry program. I highly recommend it. I've talked to her at length about psychiatry, mental health, and the biopsychosocial model to treating mental health disorders. So I can't advocate for her work enough. I hope you consider working with her if you're struggling with any number of issues from depression, addiction, anxiety, anorexia, etc. So without further ado, I hope you enjoy this conversation, parts 1 and parts 2, with Dr. Robin Carhart-Harris. All right, enjoy. So let's, we've been tabling this the last hour and a half, but things keep coming up, and we're building up a lot of interesting ideas, and I'm really enjoying this. Let's now dive into your brain imaging work, which is what you're most known for. So let's just start at a very basic level. How did you get into that? And by brain imaging work, for people who don't know, as we alluded to earlier, you were the first to do brain imaging work for people on psilocybin, LSD, DMT as well, MDMA.
Yeah, I need to be fair to my peers. We did the first fMRI research with LSD, psilocybin, but there were some others. Franz Vollenweider did PET imaging work with psilocybin before us, and a chap, some German researchers, Daumann, did some DMT fMRI, albeit not resting state. So I just want to be fair to my peers. And actually, there was another German team that did the first mescaline brain imaging study back in the 80s.
Really?
So a lot of this stuff gets forgotten in a sense because it wasn't part of the Renaissance wave. But we did do some pretty pioneering stuff. We did the first human LSD work since the 60s. And,
but by the way, just a quick note, mescaline does not get a lot of attention. Maybe it should. It's longer lasting, as I understand it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I feel like that's going to be, as soon as MDMA, psilocybin, things like that get approved, maybe 10 years down the road, maybe mescaline there'll be more studies on like what's the particular utility of mescaline as opposed to other drugs.
And I suspect it has some, it's kind of molecularly, it's a little related to MDMA, so it could be a bit of a hybrid in that sense. Classic psychedelic MDMA and pathogen heart opening hybrid, which sounds pretty good.
Plus hallucinogenic, right?
Yeah,
as
with
well
a long heritage as well.
San Pedro cactus.
You might even say it is the prototypical psychedelic because it's the one that Humphrey Osmond gave to Aldous Huxley when just a few years later, Humphrey Osmond came up with the term psychedelic, dissatisfied with hallucinogen, psychotomimetic, psychoplastic. He said, these are interesting, but they just point to one specific aspect of the experience. We need to come up with another term. Aldous Huxley came up with phanrothyme, and kind of funny, speaking to something that psychedelic speaks to. The psychedelic means soul, revealing, illuminating, and that's what stuck. So it was mescaline that kind of triggered that initial focused interest, and then soon LSD and psilocybin.
And for reference, Aldous Huxley has probably the greatest account of someone writing about their experience, The Doors of Perception. I'm sure you read it.
I actually agree.
On his mescaline experience, the most incredibly written articulation of the psychedelic experience.
So far seeing. that guy had incredible intuition about the action. I've come up with this rebus model, and you can see hints in that direction in the doors of perception. And actually, Aldous Huxley credits some of his insights to Henri Bergson, the French philosopher, who had a certain model of consciousness that suggested that the brain, as Aldous Huxley would put it, the brain in the main is eliminative. It constrains information, and it's more like a filter, So Aldous Huxley framed it as this reducing valve. We only get a narrow chink of light through the cave, and then that opens up under the psychedelic. So these are very consistent models. It's kind of, it tickles me to realize, I only realized quite recently that the rebus model, in a sense, could be tracked back to Henri Bergson. And then you think, well, who before him? Who inspired him to come up with that idea? It's a funny old thing how these ideas work.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about rebus, but go back to your brain imaging work.
Oh yeah, so that started around. I went knocking on a couple of doors. David Nutt and Amanda Fielding, God rest her soul, she passed quite recently.
Rest in
her
peace.
And David were key to my career. So very sad that she's so recently passed.
Yeah, I'm glad. I watched her on Joe Rogan's podcast a couple of years ago. I'm glad that interview happened. It was a great conversation, except for the drilling holes in the head piece.
Right.
Putting
That's
that sort of
tricky. It makes people, squeamish. Yeah, understandably. Yeah.
But the psychedelics portion was fascinating. So I enjoyed it.
And what a character! And it was really her and David Nutt that gave me my chance. But I went knocking on their door saying I wanted to do LSD, fMRI research, and Amanda said, "Me too," and David Nutt said, "Not yet, but." Opened the door and said, come and do a PhD and study the serotonin system. And 3.5 years later, Amanda's still there saying, oh, can we do LSD now? And David Nutt says, I think we're ready. I think Robin's ready and he can write a protocol. And that's how it happened. I wanted to do LSD. Amanda did too. But together we realized that psilocybin would be an easier nut to crack. So we proposed psilocybin, talked to researchers in Switzerland who'd given psilocybin IV, so we proposed to do it IV. Felix Hassler helped us along, and that's how we started it off. Around 2008, we developed the protocol, got it IRB approved, and started dosing people. Probably 2008 in Bristol in the west of England, and 2009, David and I moved to Imperial College London, where I was at for 12 years. I founded the Center for Psychedelic Research, first in the world, in 2019, April 2019.
Really, the first in the world?
Yeah, it was. Yeah. A few months before Hopkins.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. you have that edge over Matt. You guys can fight till the death on that one. No, just kidding.
Oh no, we're friends.
Yeah. And by the way, was there any prior brain imaging research on psychedelics before?
It was Franz's pet work. So positron emission tomography is like a snapshot camera picture of accumulated metabolism in the brain. So it doesn't really tell you anything about brain dynamics, but it does tell you where was hot in terms of activity in the brain. So he'd done that and he published in 1997, I think. So credit where it's due. That was very pioneering work. When we did our fMRI work and started getting the results around 2009, 10, we published it in 2012. We were surprised because we were seeing some unexpected findings. We saw drops in blood flow in the default mode network. I can describe that. We saw drops in activity, and we saw a desynchrony in the default mode network. And actually, of those three findings, it's the desynchrony that has proved to be the most reliable and meaningful finding. At that time, I think we misinterpreted the results and thought that psilocybin and maybe psychedelics more generally decreased activity. That's proven not to be the case.
In the default mode network?
Yeah, it's the psychedelics dysregulate activity. Josh Siegel, who published in Nature recently, likes to call it desynchronize activity, and that's good. That works. And I use this entropic brain model, which is more about a dysregulation, a move towards what the general public would call chaos or disorder.
Yeah, and we should. I have questions on this a lot, and I didn't know that this is something that you thought of about that. It's not reduced activity in the default mode networks, because that was popularized.
It's scrambled, if you want.
Okay.
I use the analogy of a snow globe around that time.
That makes more sense. Okay, but before I ask you about that, what people don't know, so default mode network is a series of connected regions in the brain, which has been understood to be associated with ego, with self-referential thought, contemplating future and past, the sense of self, sense of I, which is often heightened with people who are in depression. They're thinking about their suffering. They're thinking about how they were victims of X, Y, or Z, abuse, trauma. There's a lot of self, which religious philosophies talk a lot about the worship of the self, or the obsessive focus on the self creates suffering, right?
Yeah, narcissism, yeah. Anything that's self-focused, that's internally focused, and mostly that's bad, because it takes you away from the world. Sometimes it can be fantasy and daydream and creativity, but generally speaking, if you're stuck in your head and introspecting, you're probably using the default mode network real estate to do that processing. It's the most metabolically hungry aspect of the brain, contributes most of the eating up of energy, and the brain as an organ eats up most of the body's energy, something like 40% of it.
Really? What is Just another thought, by the way. It's interesting because I'm thinking a lot about mindfulness these days. And like a lot of people, it's hard to be in the present moment. It's hard to be mindful, whereas thinking seems easier. Like it seems harder to just observe your thoughts and be in the present. It feels easier to just keep on thinking. But is it true to say that being mindful is actually less potentially biologically taxing? Do we know that?
Being mindful, it might be more efficient and economical to be mindful than to be ruminative. Yeah, maybe you draw in more of the reservoir if you're ruminative. You get, William James described depression as an active anguish, So there's a lot, and people are often tired in depression. It suggests that you're metabolically working really hard in there to work out what the hell's going on. I think reactive depressions, like depressions that follow a bereavement or, being sacked at work or losing a relationship, that you're often like trying to work out what happened there and locked in the head because of it. I think metabolically, there's a disproportionate focus of that energy within your head, within the default mode network. I think that's a fair model. Yeah, so mindfulness is probably a more efficient, easy breezy. I mean, intuitively, it seems to be use of energy.
You're saying mindfulness could be associated with less use of energy than rumination?
Well, I'm highly speculative here, but when you're mindful, whether in day-to-day interactions, you're in the present moment, you're present-centered would be a definition. If you're meditating, you might be focusing on the breath, say, at least as a starting point. So there's something to that focus, and if you observe anything like ruminative thoughts, you watch them and let them go, right? And that, should then gently bring you back to the breath, is the way you do mindfulness of breath, at least. So I don't know. I'm going to guess that energy-wise, and these, very experienced meditators tend to live a long life, it seems. Low stress will be part of that, but maybe they're quite economical with how they use their energy reserves as well.
So you're stuff. Yeah, you're speculating that mindfulness might be less biologically taxing.
Yeah, I think, being depressed is biologically taxing. I think it's
Yeah.
exhausting. But I would, just to orient us on the psychedelics and the default mode network, that
Yeah,
early
and
work.
actually, before I'm just going to say on that point, which I know when talking to people like you, there's going to be so many, just like the Peterson conversation. There's all these other
Mm,
things that come up, which is fascinating.
mm,
But
mm.
I say that because I was thinking a lot about, like, say, going out driving, and at times it feels like daydreaming or just getting lost in thought. Say, after a hard day's work, that seems easier than being present. But at other times, it could feel more easy to be present too. And obviously, meditation teachers like Sam Harris, who I'm a big fan of the meditation teachings, and people like Adyashanti, Locke Kelly, a bunch of these people, will advocate that meditative awareness, pure consciousness, is our true, original, pure state, and that's actually the easiest state that you can be in. And on some non-dualistic level, it's always there. You're never away from it, and that's actually easier. But it does seem to be the case for the vast majority of people to get into that awareness is very hard and often frustrating, and so it can feel very biologically tired. Like, why do I keep thinking? Why am I keep getting lost in
Yeah,
thought?
yeah, yeah.
I've been meditating for 30 minutes and I keep thinking about the future. What the fuck's wrong with me? What the fuck? And
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
like, it feels
Oh, that's
taxing,
such a
right? But
classic experience for people. Silencing the monkey mind is it's hard as hell. Yeah, I think it might have been William Blake said the busy bee has no time for sorrow. That's one I like. When you're getting on, you're not perhaps ruminating. Um, yeah, back to William Wordsworth and the infant just existing. An infant doesn't ruminate; they just, want their food or want their nappy change or whatever, or are tired. They're quite simple in that sense. So, yeah, I mean, just going with the flow might be another way of thinking of like a good use of resources, whether it's necessarily sitting down and trying to focus on your breath or just showing up in the world and getting on with things. Yeah, but then that can sometimes be a defense mechanism, a way to avoid, that busy bee that has no time for sorrow might be keeping busy because they don't want to be sorrowful and work through some difficult stuff. So, there's all of that.
yeah, back to psychedelics. You were gonna
Yeah,
explain.
I guess the three findings all converge on the default mode network, and this has stood the test of time.
And just
Josh
to
Simple,
reiterate for people in sort of simple layman's terms, what were the
yeah,
three findings?
drops in blood flow, drops in activity, and
In the default mode
desynchronize,
network, the ego, the home of the
all
ego in the brain.
converging on the default mode network. 2010, I proposed it was the seat of the ego, also with Carl Friston, actually, in a paper in the quite a classic journal, Brain. And that was the default mode in ego functions. So even before we saw the patterns in the brain, I was speculating that the default mode network might be implicated because evidence seemed to implicate it in the sense of self, in the ego. And you think, well, psychedelics are ego dissolvers. Maybe we'll see something there. Oh, we see drops in blood flow and activity and a desynchrony. That must be the neural correlates of ego dissolution. So that's how it went. And over time, we see things like we use different modalities to look at brain waves. We used MEG to look at brain waves and saw again that there's a desynchrony within centers of the default mode network. If listeners don't know what the hell I'm talking about and need some spatial reference, probably many of them, there's two regions in the midline. If you were to split a brain in half, you would have one at the front, the medial prefrontal cortex, one in the middle towards the back, the posterior cingulate cortex. That's kind of the backbone of the default mode network. And then two bits at the side, you call them, various names, but inferior parietal lobule, left and right. So a bit like a cross in a sense, front, back, and either side. As in like a Christian cross. Weird thought there, but yeah, that's what the default mode network looks like.
Don't go Peterson on me. he likes drawing these connections. Well, actually, that's because in the Old Testament it said this, and that's because they were doing psilocybin, and it's the whatever.
yeah, Christian connection. Divine intervention.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean that's the pattern, and that was popping up, and it kept popping up. In some studies, it popped up where the bigger the effect in the default mode network, the bigger people's ratings of ego dissolution. We actually saw that in our MEG work. The bigger the drop in a certain rhythm, the alpha rhythm in the posterior cingulate cortex, middle towards the back, the bigger ego dissolution. That's popping up again. Actually, some collaborations with scientists at Stanford are seeing this same region being implicated in like the genetics of schizophrenia and some other converging things. There's so much actually that suggests that consciousness research as well, different ways of looking at consciousness, anesthetics and so on, suggests this posterior cingulate cortex is literally being called a hotspot for consciousness. And I think it is a hotspot for human consciousness, for ego consciousness, I call it. I mean, others would call it that too, but I've got a book coming, How Psychedelics Work, and there I use that terminology, ego consciousness. And I compare it with something called phenomenal consciousness, which is simply subjective experience. It's just what it feels like. But ego consciousness is human consciousness, comes with all these faculties that we have, analytical thinking, sense of self, all this complex, abilities that we have. And that ego consciousness, I think the DMN, the default mode network, and this PCC region, if you have to spatially locate that thing, that's where you'd look.
And how do we know that's not just like a correlational, irrelevant finding versus potentially causational, or however we want to frame it?
Well, the relation between mind and brain is always correlational. It's like two sides of the same coin. I like the wave-particle duality of quantum physics as an analogy, because you could look at a photon as a particle or light as a wave. And actually, depending on how you look at it, it'll look like a particle sometimes. And you look at it in a different way and it looks like a wave. And both are just as valid. And I think it's similar with mind and brain. So it is correlational, yet it's one and the same, but different in aspect. So it's not the brain causes mind. That would be hard materialism. That would be your Sam Harris and your billiard balls.
Robert Sapolsky, Stanford.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Deterministic view of reality. Deterministic plus randomness.
Yeah, whereas I see it as fundamentally both dual aspect. The philosophy is called dual aspect monism or property dualism. It says mind and brain are different in aspect, just as particle and wave are different at the quantum level in terms of how they look when you measure them. But they're also curiously one and the same thing at the same time, which does your head in. But that's the way it is. Quantum phenomena is weird, but that's the way it is. I think it's similar for mind and brain. I know it's weird, and we tend to think in linear causal ways. We tend to like to think of billiard balls, but science isn't about what you like and what you want to be true. It's about what's actually true.
Yeah. Oh man, we could spend 2 hours. We could spend 2 hours just on that topic. And I'll say one thing on that. And I don't want to go too far down this rabbit hole, but I'll just say that, Alan Watts, who I'm sure you've read and listened to. I've listened to a lot. His recordings are in the Waking Up app. All of Alan Watts' legendary talks, and he points out he was a famous philosopher in the 70s and 80s. Blending East and West and scientific versus mythology, and he talks about how you can't locate the self anywhere. You can't reduce ego or self until here's the self in this one spot in my brain or in this part. It's like you can't really locate it, and as a matter of subjective experience, well, I mean, there's debate there. Sam Harris would say you can't locate the self. My friend Bobby Azarian say you could. I've gone back and forth. I do think there is an element of illusoriness to the self, which the non-dual Buddhists and Hindus are right about. But
well, Well, I do too. I do too, for what it's worth. There's something to that Platonic and view, and like the cave, only seeing shadows, and there's something to hierarchical predictive processing. In fact, I'd say that that's the dominant model of neuroscience, human neuroscience today, that we experience the world through internal construction, in a sense, internal predictive models. So there's a lot. There is a lot to that view. It's just I wouldn't take it to the extreme of saying that that's the only thing, that everything has no substance and it's all just a dream, that it's a simulation, perhaps. I tend to think that starts to oversell the point. And to the question of where is the self, does it have a location? I would go to a relational explanation. I would say it's between, as is so much of things, is that they're fundamentally relational. And that's another, Buddhist idea of, I can't quite remember how it's phrased, but that things exist because of an interaction, because of a relation. Thich Nhat Hanh would talk about this kind of thing. I can't quite remember what it's called.
Are you referring to independent?
Sorry, Rav. Mutually interdependent.
Mutual interdependence or interdependent arising. Different names for it. And oh my God, we're gonna. Okay, I want to go into this just for a minute, but then we'll go back to psychedelics. But it's I remember interdependent arising. We can double check in a second. But then how you're because you're. And that idea is basically that everything arises together, and that you can't actually find a cause for anything. Like, I'm feeling depressed. Well, what's the cause? My girlfriend left me. Well, what's the cause of that? Well, maybe I misbehaved or she cheated on me. Well, what's the cause of that? Well, she cheated on her because maybe she had some trauma from childhood and she saw her mom cheat on her dad. And well, what caused that? Well, and you can't find a single cause for anything. And so that sort of idea is sort of used to justify the deterministic or anti-free will view that people like Sam Harris have. So I'm just curious how you square those two things, the interdependent arising or the illusion of self with free will and agency. Not that this is the main topic of our podcast, but this is endlessly fascinating.
I mean, it's such a hard one that I'm not sure I can say anything too lucid on it, other than I'm very warm to that view of the way things are. I would probably describe myself as a secular Buddhist, in a sense. Like, I love Buddhist philosophy, and that particular view of interdependent arising, that everything is fundamentally relational. Why do we have a visual system? In a sense, because of the sun and sunlight. You start tracing everything to something else, and you can't escape it. You realize that you're in this web of relations, that things really, and you see this at the quantum level as well, that everything is relational and sort of exists between, things like quantum entanglement. There's no escaping the relational. And the self, sure, you might locate it spatio-temporally in the default mode network, but how did it come about? How did it develop? Well, it probably developed through relational phenomena as the infant grew into being an adult. In fact, we know that the default mode network, the integrity of it within the nodes of the default mode network, the connections between those nodes strengthen as we mature. It's very maturation coupled, that network.
And then for the last thing, how do you bring free will into that, as opposed to the billiard ball determinism view of Sam Harris or Sapolsky?
Well, clearly there is causation. I mean, we were just referring to it with the interdependency view. So things cause things, but that causation can be circular. It can be bidirectional. There's so many examples where mind stuff, idea stuff, I think leads to biology. Take placebo, for example. What is the placebo response? There's good evidence that the mere belief that you're getting, say, a painkiller leads to the induction of natural painkillers, endorphins. Just through thinking you were getting one, you start releasing naturally occurring opioids in your body. So, what happens when you cross the country or countries to attend a funeral, say, that's like a complex abstract idea thing that is driving you to, you're going to alter your biology and all of that, let's say the sleep deprivation and the time zone differences. And so so much of what's happening is happening in a sense top down, if you want, or from mind to body. And so this whole billiard ball thing is just massively oversold. It's a little bit absurd in a sense. And I think there's a mixing of semantics from there is causation, which obviously there's causation, to there is determinism, like everything is predetermined. It's like, oh, go on then, work out why I just did that. Really? Wasn't that a bit surprising? It's like, yeah, I don't know. I just don't buy that. And I don't think many people do. I think it's quite an extreme view that we have no free will and everything is predetermined.
Right.
It's like, go on then, work it out. And they'll say, oh, yeah, it's really hard. And then it's like, yeah, it's freaking hard to a point that, like, you can't actually do it, right? So what's the point?
Well, then they add randomness. They say it's determinism plus randomness. You still don't have free will. You still can't explain it, but you can't. But you don't. That doesn't give you free will if you can't explain it.
It just becomes like a pointless argument. I find that again, it just brings us back, I think, to causation. I just don't buy it. It doesn't feel compelling. In fact, I heard Sean Carroll say just this. Just doesn't feel right. It's quite funny to hear a well-respected physicist just say, nah, just doesn't feel right. Doesn't resonate. And maybe, Sam Harris would say, well, Sean Carroll's deluding himself. He doesn't want to believe it. I would almost say Sam Harris is driving a point because he wants to believe it. And I wonder why. It's a funny old belief. I don't know. Does it take away agency? Does it make you think it wasn't my fault if something's happened that you wish hadn't happened? Oh, it was determinism. Is it that? Like, why would you want to believe that thing that doesn't feel right? Just doesn't feel compelling. And logically, I just don't think it feels compelling. I think it's an overuse of the fact that there is causation. Causation isn't determinism.
Yeah. Well, last thing on this, I guess, is on the mind level. Sam Harris will make at least somewhat compelling argument or observation, which I've actually more recently, which is why I've been talking to Bobby a lot. I've recently observed this, which is like, where do thoughts come from? And I've recently, in meditation, just going about my day, I'll be driving home from, going to the gym, working out, driving home. Suddenly thought pops up of something that happened in high school or something totally random. Oh, one time I was playing soccer, 10 years ago, and I hurt my foot. And this thing, it's like, well, where did that come from? And there's this sense of like, where did that? I didn't really originate that thought. Like, so that's a major argument. People like Sam and
psychedelics as well. I thought we might bring this up, but when psychedelics increase entropy and the richness of phenomenal consciousness, well, it's surprising as hell. Like, where did that come from? Like the case, your experience that you were describing, that surprising revisiting of childhood and like, relationship with the mother and so on. Like, that is a strange kind of, was there determinism there or it's causation? Yeah.
That's a hard one. What is the origin of thoughts? The thoughts just seem to come to us, and so are we really authoring them, or?
Yeah, right. It seems to come spontaneous. Seems to have an unconscious sort of implicit directionality to it, a teleology. But there's also that thing of more agency afterwards that we were talking about at the beginning of this conversation. You could interpret that as more freedom, more free will. So how is it an illusion if you can modulate it?
Oh,
Are
right.
you
And
more?
to
Are you?
clarify, you mean by being aware, then you're aware of
Yeah,
the thought came, and then you're like, oh,
yeah,
what do I do with it now? Now that I'm aware, instead of just being captive, is that what you're?
yeah. The recovery of agency, of self empowerment, when you know yourself better or you know your psyche better. Oh, I was doing this. I was so blind to how I was doing this. I didn't realize that I was drinking alcohol excessively to escape, these complex traumas from my childhood. I didn't realize that there was this odd compulsion to repeat. And my
Right.
father was an alcoholic or what have you. And I'm inadvertently trying to be like my father. I don't know. There's all sorts of complex
Right.
dynamics at play.
Or
Yeah,
even just on like a just raw experience level. You're driving or whatever. You're talking, and you remember something someone said mean to you on Twitter, and then with the mindful awareness, if you've cultivated it, it's like, do I want to spend the next 2 minutes angry or anxious or whatever about what someone said, or can we disidentify with that? Because if you didn't have that awareness, you would just spend the next 2 minutes or whatever, 1 hour, like, why the fuck did that person say that on
yeah.
Twitter? Or
I
you
mean,
could,
that's yeah, some ability to like cognitively diffuse, to be like, this could really trigger me. Well, let's be honest, this has really triggered me. Now it could possess my mind for the next, however long, because I can't let it go. Or with experience and some wisdom and maybe some practices, I'll do something that I believe will help me get through this.
hmm,
Um, Maybe some psychotherapeutic practices like you might associate with acceptance and commitment therapy. I will, have a look at this thing. I'll look at it from different angles, and then
yeah.
I'll decide to let it go. Um, that acceptance phenomenon. I'll just accept that it's
Yeah.
there.
And is that where
So
you would sort of associate free will or agency?
yeah, like agency, empowerment. Yeah, and I do think you can modulate this thing. So if it doesn't exist, isn't it odd that you can, I believe, modulate it and increase it, or have it low, pathologically low in psychopathology, for example, where you could say that this person is sleepwalking, into oblivion through drinking themselves to death. They're
Right.
so blind. They're so
Right.
blind. They're so predetermined. They have no free will. The drug has taken them over. They're possessed, like a
Yeah.
demonic possession. Gabor Mate would say this kind of thing. There, I
Yeah.
would say, okay, it does look like predeterminism. Like,
Yeah.
and also if they've had a really, shitty upbringing and background and a lot of trauma, then again, it looks like predeterminism. But what they have a psychedelic experience and realize how it's all come about. They take ibogaine and have some kind of profound reset, and
Yeah.
now they're like working out and they're vegan and they haven't touched a drop of alcohol for many years. Like, how the hell does that happen if there's no free will?
Right. And the irony is, by the way, Sam, the reason why I'm a fan of him, I'm not a fan of the free will stuff, but I am a fan of his meditation app, Waking Up. And that's actually it's the exact opposite. My friend Bobby and I were always talking about it. It's the meditation app. It's like, you are free in this moment, this sort of non-dual pure consciousness idea. You are free in this moment to decide what you want to do. Do you want to spend this moment worrying about the past or worrying about future? Or do you want to be in the present and enjoy your kids? Or even he'll say, like, or do you just want to wash the dishes right now? Or do you want to wash the dishes and worry about future or past? And so that's like encouraging a sense of agency. But when it comes to scientific philosophy, he's oddly deterministic. I don't know how those two things
Yeah,
square. I mean,
yeah.
he squares it as in you can have an experience of supposed free will, but actually you don't have free will. So he just sort of does it that way. But
I just don't know who that's good for. Is it really good for Sam? I doubt it. Is it good for anyone else? I doubt it. Is it true? No, I doubt it. Doesn't feel right, as Sean Carroll would
yeah,
say.
he
I
says
don't
there's
know.
more compassion and love. You understand people better. You don't blame. You don't hate them.
Okay, there's that. Yeah, in a like psychoanalytic way. Oh, you didn't realize, all those terrible things that you endured, why you are how you are now. So it does, and psychedelic therapy does this. It promotes
Yeah.
empathy because of a deeper understanding. So I do understand that, and I would say although maybe I've beaten up on Sam a little bit around that topic. More generally, I'm more of a fan than a critic.
Yeah, you were on his podcast, right?
Yeah, I was a bit of a sideshow there, but I'd love to speak with him again.
Yeah,
And
me
more
too.
generally, I do admire what he does. Yeah,
Yeah. I interviewed him a couple years ago. We talked about meditation,
cool.
and it was fascinating. It's on my Substack. Back to the default mode network. I was going to say this is really, and I'm fascinated that you said this, that it's so it's how did that shift happen? Because the idea was always that the default mode network, or sorry, that psychedelics. Wait, that psychedelics, yes, lower activity in the default mode network. Now you're saying that consensus has changed to lowering in synchronicity.
Yeah, I would say that was never a consensus. It was a narrative that, I might have been culpable for sharing for a few years. I think people haven't always kept up with that. I have moved away from it. And
Yeah, it's in How to Change Your Mind, I believe. Michael Pollan wrote about you
he
advocating
did,
for that.
and so he said it that way too. And so I guess people believe it because it's in such a high impact publication. My old mentor, I love the guy, but he would very much sell this thing of psychedelics shutting off the default mode network. This is David Nutt. They don't shut off the default mode network. It's still.
Yeah, I agree.
Active. Yeah, they
I was always skeptical of that. Yeah.
Well, it's an excitatory dysregulation. If people want to look into the weeds, probably originates with a spike, neurons spiking, firing, to wave. Many thousands of neurons having an electrical field oscillate that creates waves. A spike to wave decoupling is probably the origin of what then looks to our eyes when we look at an EEG recording as a signal that is harder to predict, that's more diverse across time. It's harder to predict, and that formally is entropy. Formally, entropy, in its most basic sense, is, in a sense, our uncertainty about something.
More chaos, more disorder in a potentially healthy sense.
Yeah, you can go that way. Yeah, that works.
So you found that, and then, well, two things. So first of all, can you clarify? So you found, you're now saying that default mode network, that it's more causing more disorder or chaos in the default mode network, more dysynchronicity. Yeah. And then how did you come to, and why did you first think that it was decreasing activity, and how did you change your mind on that?
Yeah, we thought it was decreasing activity because we saw blood flow as a proxy for activity, and we saw drops in blood flow. But blood flow is blood flow, and brain activity is an electrical thing, really, electrochemical thing. But we record it as electrical fields and electrical spikes, electrical potentials. So there can be a decoupling. So it could have been that the psilocybin came in and squeezed the vessels through working on the serotonin system to cause what we call a vasoconstriction. And at the same time, it's also exciting neurons, and they're spiking at unpredictable times out of sync with the more population level activity, like a soccer crowd doing a chant in union. You start having a few rogue fans, or a lot of rogue fans, randomly shouting stuff, and it's now it's not coherent anymore.
Oh, that's a good metaphor.
I use it in the book.
Yeah, fantastic. So that's really interesting, and I'm just looking at my notes here. The reason why that was interesting to me that you said that, and I was going to ask you about this, was this idea that psilocybin reduces activity in the default mode network, which you had. Wait, and also, can you explain how you changed your mind? So what led you to now think differently, that it's not reducing activity in the default mode network?
I'm not sure I said that to Michael when I sat down and said, psychedelics, decrease activity in the default mode network. He published that book in 2018. I probably described the snow globe and the entropic brain effect, but it sounded a bit complicated. So he said it's like the conductors left the room, and I was probably like, yeah, that'll work.
Wait, but didn't you just say you believed previously that it did reduce activity in the Defoe
Yeah,
network?
when we published in 2012, 2013, 14, maybe, but I published the Entropic Brain in 2014, and
Okay.
there it was like the rudiments of the idea of psychedelics actually dysregulating. It's like instead of thinking of a temperature dial, um, think of what the temperature does to the organization of a material. If you turn up heat, it's going to melt a solid, say a block of ice. Turn up heat, warm things up. That's going to become liquid. Now entropy's up. There's more movement. There's more freedom, and further, it becomes a gas, and things are like maximally spread out. And so think of organization of the thing from maximal order to disorder as your dimension, and then think of that mapping to subjective experience rather than this kind of like thermostat, like
Right.
up or down. The classic thing is people say, oh, this lights up your brain, or when you do this, it lights up your brain.
Yeah.
Activities up. There's a very clunky kind of pop science way of describing brain
Right.
function.
Yeah, and that's how I understood it too when I actually went into this, got
That's
interested in
where we
this, and
start,
reading
Yeah,
Michael
you
Pollan's
want
book.
to think,
Like the popular perception among ordinary readers like me was, normally the people are very egocentric, egotistical, but with psychedelics lowers default mode network, so that means the ego is going to go from 10 to whatever, something lower. But that's
yeah,
a highly simplistic way.
it's highly simplistic, and I would say it's probably time we moved on and improved that model
Yeah.
because it can cause misunderstandings. So when Michael Pollan says there's an orchestra and the conductor leaves the stage, sort of works. You could say there's less of the default mode network, but really it's not being decreased. It's not dialing it down from 10 to 0. It's being disorganized. It's being scrambled. And so, you might say the conductor's still there, but he's tripping balls. And now it's all like a bit chaotic out there. And so are the musicians. They're all tripping too. And
And
it
then
turns.
yeah, and what led you to that? Because you said earlier 2010, 2011, 20, but you said by 2014 the entropic brain hypothesis.
Yeah,
What led you to more the
yeah.
desynchronous?
Often it's clues. So, there's something in the desynchrony that we saw in 2012 that was a clue towards the thing. Soon after, we did an MEG study where we saw that the brain's rhythms, its waves, its oscillations, mostly all went down. And it's like, how can that happen that all rhythmicity is going away? Well, maybe it's going away because things are getting scrambled up. Rhythmicity itself is being lost in some sense. And it's happening in the default mode network regions we saw. Then we do LSD work. We see that networks become less integrous under the drug, meaning they start to break down. You could say they disintegrate, and networks also open up. We started doing more analyses on our data using different methods that ask different questions. Like the classic circles that people have seen. That's looking at how networks open up and start speaking more to each other. That would be consistent with this entropic effect, this sort of opening of filters, opening of range, of freedom. So it was clues. It was like joining the dots. And that process actually started pretty soon after publishing the 2012 work, where I might, 2012, 2013, you maybe could have heard me say that looks like psychedelics decrease brain activity in the default mode network. But it wasn't long until I was saying, no, actually, it looks like they dysregulate activity in the default mode network and other networks, and open them up. And actually, that opening.
And you believe that again because of what you just said.
It's less belief these days. Is more like, I would say, knowledge or understanding that that's what happens. It's pretty well replicated.
And sorry,
yes,
just to clarify, that's because you said you did the studies where there's a lack of there's less of the rhythmicity.
Yeah, the desynchrony we published on in 2013, broadband cortical desynchrony. And so that very much, I put those findings into the Entropic Brain paper that I published in 2014. And that was a very young, sort of flawed paper, like a hot mess in a sense. But it was there, the rudiments of the idea that psychedelics sort of dial up chaos in the brain, and that relates to a chaotic quality of mind, more in the brain, more in the mind. I refined it in 2018. I'll refine it further in my book and in a new paper I'm writing. But that's the gist of it, more in the brain, more bits of information in a very formal sense. It was Claude Shannon who coined that term, bits, and we know bits in terms of digital computing. More bits of information in brain activity, more content in subjective experience. That's the model. That's the entropic brain model. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. But so it was until you found the decrease in, how do you say it, rhythmicity? Like less
rhythmicity. I'll be fair to colleagues as well. So I worked with Anil Seth, Michael Shartner, and others. I've always benefited from collaborating. Science is fundamentally collaborative, and it works best when it's collaborative. And so I went to people with skills that I don't have. And I said, or they said to me, we could process your data and we could look at this. We could apply this data compressibility algorithm. It's called Lempel-Ziv complexity. And we could see whether the signal is more or less complex, diverse, entropic. And we did that. And across 3 drugs, we gave them data from 3 different drugs, collaborating with a guy, Suresh Muthukumu Raswamy, now back in New Zealand. And he provided the ketamine data, and we'd worked together providing LSD and psilocybin data. All 3 drugs showed this, what I now call an entropic brain effect, or an increase in the informational complexity of the ongoing signal. There was more bits in the signal under the psychedelic across those 3 drugs. So that was in
the default mode network.
Did we pinpoint the default mode network then? I'm not sure, because the MEG can't always see that deep into the brain, unlike fMRI. So I'm not sure we pointed to the default mode network there. I'd have to look back and see. It was published in 2013. Oh no, 2017 actually, that work. But we did relate it to consciousness, and it was a daring thing to do, a bit bold. And, I got critiqued for it, like I often do. I'd said this might relate to an expansion of consciousness. And people are like, oh, yeah, whatever. That sounds like pseudoscience. I would stand by that term today. I think there is a broadening of conscious content, a deepening of conscious content that maps quite reliably to the entropy of spontaneous brain activity, and that is the entropic brain principle, I would say. So you could call it an expansion of consciousness. If you want to get into the jargon, you would probably call it an expansion of phenomenal consciousness.
That's interesting. I don't want to repeat myself here again, but just to clarify, because I'm still a little confused. You're saying the findings in the of lower rhythmicity, that led you to think that the idea that the psychedelics reduce activity in the default mode network was not true?
Yeah, kind of. So this is a rhythm. Yeah. And how much information was there? Well, not much, because everything, it was only one person, but if we were both doing it in sync, there's not much information there. It's everything doing the same thing. And so it's that. If rhythmicity is going down, like us clapping in sync, then this regularity is going down.
Yeah.
And so it sort of follows that. So there's a dysregulation, because the activity doesn't go away. The brain doesn't die. So it's getting scrambled is the kind of intuition. Then this really interesting question follows. Well, where's the order out of the chaos? Like, is there rhythmicity elsewhere? And actually, these days, I would say I think there is, and I think um, we're seeing from some animal recordings, we see hints of it in human data, where the lens isn't quite so sharp because of seeing activity often through the scalp rather than seeing in the brain matter in a mouse, say. The activity seems to get the rhythms don't disappear, they just get faster. They get up into a higher frequency range of about, say, 100 cycles per second, rather than what we're used to in normal waking consciousness. There's a dominant 10 cycles per second. That's the alpha frequency. That collapses, and you start to see these faster frequency oscillations. So the increase in bits of information might be being carried by faster rhythms. And also, if you look at spatial patterns in normal waking consciousness, you tend to see big patterns that are quite coarse grain. Think of a paintbrush, like a fat paintbrush. That if you're painting a brain and you've got a really fat paintbrush, you might cover like half of it in a single stroke. That's coarse grain. That's a fat paintbrush. Now imagine you've got very fine grained paintbrushes, very thin, and you get a few of them, and you with different colors, and you paint. Now we've got a finer grain, and that's what you see under psychedelics with fMRI. You get more fine grained patterns, spatial patterns, like arabesque art, like patterns in a mosque, say, more detail, more fine grained detail, like a Persian mosque, rather than some like minimalist architecture. There's more detail. You see that in the brain, more fine grained spatial patterns under the psychedelic. So finer and faster is how I say it these days. If you look under the hood of the entropic brain effect, you seem to see faster and finer. So it's not white noise chaos. It's not thermodynamic equilibrium. It's not a gas equally spread out in a room. It's there's some order, there's some organization. It's just in a higher frequency.
And so it was the rhythmicity finding alone, or something else that then led you to change your mind on the reduction in default mode network activity?
It's always a combination of things, but that was really interesting to see. Well, what's going up? Because everything seems to be going down. And what is going down? Well, it is rhythmicity. What is rhythmicity? It's order, it's organization. Organization is going down. You join the dots, you look at other people's work, you see excitatory effects in the cortex in animal work, for example. So that contributed a lot.
Okay.
So it's joining the dots.
Yeah. The reason why I'm focusing so much on this, and this is so fascinating, and I didn't know that you had changed your mind on this, or that there even was a change, and so this is news to me. This is fascinating. But the reason why I used to believe that, right, the sort of naive perspective again of, I'm reading that in depression or anxiety or OCD or whatever, and I had symptoms of sort of all those things, that there's a high sense of ego. You're thinking about yourself, thinking about future, thinking about past. And then I read Michael Pollan's book, and then it's like, I'm going to go do psychedelics to lower DMN activity, and then therefore that's going to fix me or whatever. But first of all, experientially, that didn't really work out. And then I became more skeptical of that idea recently, because the idea that psychedelics reduce default mode network activity, which is associated with mental time travel, going to future, going to past, thinking about yourself, thinking about what's happened to you. Well, all that does happen on psychedelics. Like, at least that's my experience. That's what many people go through, right? You're not oftentimes on psilocybin. You'll think about past, what happened to you. You're processing trauma. So that was confusing to me, and I was skeptical. I'm like, wait, if it's lowering default mode network activity, and default mode network is thinking about yourself and what happened to you and self-rumination, well, that's weird, because oftentimes on psychedelics, there is a lot of self-rumination and deep introspection. And to add one more layer to this, I differentiate between ordinary self-rumination, which I think is very toxic, like just bouncing around, thoughts about past versus, say, psychotherapy or, say, journaling, or even now with ChatGPT is very helpful for journaling, where you're deliberately ruminating on the past in a very healthy way of breaking down, like, oh, this happened, I'm still thinking about it, here's why it's negative, right? Journaling can really help with that. Psychotherapy can help with that. Psychedelics can help with that. Versus washing dishes or taking your kid to soccer practice and you're like, fuck, that thing from 10 years ago is just really bothering me, and fuck, man, I just feel really shitty from that. And that's totally different kind of, that's an unhealthy, toxic form of self-rumination. But that always, again, struck me as confusing of why there was a claim of lower default mode network activity when psychedelics seem to heighten self-rumination in a healthy way, or a negative way too. But
yeah. I mean, I would say probably ego dissolution is a more consistent direction of things, but the way to help you out here is to come back to the language. I would say dysregulate. It dysregulates default mode network functioning, and in parallel dysregulates self-functioning. So it doesn't kill anything related to the self, although dose dependently, it might.
Yeah,
people say 5-MeO high doses ego, obliteration. It's like, it is a gas, then it's evaporation, it's gone. But at lower doses, it's like a loosening of the self, and yes, there's more exploration, there's more freedom. So there is more freedom of movement.
Yeah.
Both in default mode network dynamics, as seen through, say, fMRI, and we know phenomenologically there's more freedom of movement, just as you were describing, exploring this, exploring that, maybe getting out of narratives that would be canalized. They're overweighted, they're stuck in a rut, they're overly reinforced, getting out of stories, dominant beliefs.
But does that make sense, what I said? Like, if you're operating from the premise of, oh, you're lowering default mode network activity, and default mode network is self-rumination, thinking of past and future, that doesn't really work with what experientially people are ruminating.
You're 100% right. What I would say is, if you were to look at the Entropic Brain paper, I think I stack the subjective ratings of the phenomenology of the psychedelic experience, where one of the top rated items is my mind wandered freely. And so I make just the point that you're making, that how can that be true if you shut off the default mode network? Because that's a default mode network attribute. At least that's how we think of it, as a daydreamy network. And so whether I say it as concretely as I'm trying to say now, the conclusion was it's not shut off. It's just scrambled up. It's liberated in a sense. It's liberated in a way where its boundaries are breached.
So it's not lowered, it's expanded. It's
I wouldn't say expanded, because that starts to sound, you could misunderstand that as like ego expansion. Maybe that can happen under psychedelics, but it's more the exception than the rule.
It's disorganized or reorganized.
Disorganized, maybe reorganized after a day or a week or a month.
But it's not lowered, and so
it's not lowered. It's scrambled up. I mean, I know that's really vague, but it's I'm trying to use sort of everyday vernacular. It's scrambled up. It's dysregulated. Disorganized.
So this is making sense. So this is, I appreciate you explaining this. This is shaping my understanding now in a healthy way. I guess let's just spend a couple more minutes on entropic brain hypothesis before we go. We can go another 2 hours if we wanted to, because there's like 20 other questions I have for you. But let's just kind of close on a bit of this, go a bit deeper for a few more minutes into this one area, the entropic brain hypothesis. So this is a paper you published in 2014. Is that right?
Yeah.
So I was looking into it, and there's just so much to talk about on that front. And, this idea that that mental health disorders are often associated with this hyper order or hyper rigid thought patterns of past, future, whether it's I'm unworthy, I can't find love in my life, there's no purpose to life, whatever, I'm sad, I'm lonely, I can't make friends, or I need to use this substance in order to escape reality, right? You're stuck in these loops, whether it's OCD, PTSD, depression, addiction, anxiety, etc. And so it's interesting how psychedelics can introduce this entropy, this disorder, this chaos, can, as we said, can kind of scramble things, and that can help create new connections, can just shake things up enough so that you're looking at things from a new perspective instead of that rigid perspective. And that's, we talked about free will and agency earlier. It's really interesting because it just, experientially speaking, people who are struggling in life, and I'm noticing this in myself as I do my own inner healing work of like, human beings were highly predictive in some sense, and particularly you see this very acutely with people who are struggling with depression. It's the same thoughts and narratives on repeat over and over and over again. And referring back to myself, I'm seeing this in my own psychotherapy work of certain narratives I've been telling myself since kindergarten of toxic notions of self that I've had, which I've recognized are impacting my relationship life. And there's an orderliness there, and so it's really an illuminating, beautiful way of looking at psychedelics. That you're introducing this entropy, which I've experienced on MDMA, where it's like I'm thinking about things as one way, but then on the MDMA, it's like, wait, is that really true? Is that really how I want to think about things? What if I think about things in a different way that aligns with your model of introducing this chaos or disorder in a healthy sense to create new order and to create new patterns and new narratives? Because again, people who are stuck in addiction or depression, it's the same toxic stuff. And I'm sure you can also attest to this, as a lot of people can experientially. Someone who's in depression, right? It's the same stories over and over again. And in some sense, it's not anything new. And so there's like an order there, which is an interesting insight, because it's sort of paradoxical maybe, but people who are maybe in a depression or an addiction, to say that what you're going through is very orderly, it's like, wait, is it? There's a kind of experientially, there's a kind of disorder. There feels like a lack of, say, robust purpose. People have depression or addiction. There's like a lack. There feels like a lack of order. It feels like there's no meaning. There's no purpose. Reality is kind of structureless. It's kind of, you're falling aside. You don't really know what the meaning or purpose of life is. But in actuality, the fact that you're repeating those thought patterns over and over again every day, that's an orderliness in and of itself within the sort of depressive.
It's less freedom. Entropy means uncertainty and unpredictability. If we flip it on its head, what's the thing of low entropy? Well, that thing is regular. It's predictable. We can say it's precise. And the dynamics, the biological dynamics that mirror that predictability, precision, are regular. If we want to put it into subjective terms, predictability gives us confidence. Unpredictability causes us uncertainty. When, even though this might seem paradoxical, in psychopathology, whether it's an addiction, OCD, PTSD, a phobia, anorexia, body dysmorphic disorder, even a delusion in a psychotic disorder, delusions, illusions in depression, negative cognitive biases, they're all habits where we've imbued a thing, a feeling, a thought, or a behavior with too much weight. We've overweighted it. We've made it too precise. And that I know that might feel funny for people to think that there's a confidence in my way of being. Well, in a sense, yeah, because you really believe that you're a worthless piece of shit, say, and
right, or that finding love is impossible. Finding, that's a common.
Yeah, there you go, and they believe it absolutely. You ask them to rate that 0 to 100, which we do, by the way. You ask people to rate their, pathological beliefs, and they'll
Really?
rate it super high. You ask people to rate, belief in anorexia, like I need my anorexia, it gives me value in life. They'll rate it, really high.
Wow.
So yeah, these beliefs, you find that they're really at the core of things. In fact, we've seen in studies that they're more sensitive to change than core symptomatology itself. Like you'd call it an ego-syntonic belief in anorexia, a belief about how the anorexia serves you. Like, it makes me thin. Thin's great. That is rated and rated way too high, way too much in the anorexia, won't shift after placebo. Symptom severity might shift after placebo with a bunch of talking therapy, but that core belief doesn't. And then you give them psilocybin and it falls off a cliff, and they're like, why did I believe that thing?
Wow.
Obviously, the anorexia is making me sick and unhealthy. So it's amazing in that sense. It seems to really kind of
That's beautiful.
Yeah. And the jargon is canalization. I call it the canalization model of psychopathology. That's a bunch of jargon for saying you get stuck in ruts in mental illnesses.
You talked about that with Jordan Peterson at length.
Okay, cool. Yeah, and that goes back to Henri Bergson canalization. So I didn't realize that until very recently, actually. But a canal, which was the analogy, is like a rut that you cut into the earth for water to flow in. That water will flow in just one dimension, forwards or back. So it doesn't have much freedom. If you had a flat plane, that water could move everywhere. So that's kind of the analogy. It's constraining freedom. It's cutting a path that then causes some degree of predetermination, coming back to free will versus determinism. In a sense, you do lose free will, rather. You lose free will in psychopathology. You become enslaved or possessed by the illness.
That brings up philosophical questions of, well, what is a line for psychopathology and not regular psychological, normal psychological health, right? On some level, everyone's kind of struggling with something, right?
They are. And, there's a funny old thing. I don't know who said it, or I imagine someone must have, but freedom and happiness are very close, or freedom and wellness are very close. There's something, I think, like fundamental about the relationship between the two. Just as I'm describing psychopathology, the main thing in psychopathology, you'd call it the principal component of psychopathology, is getting stuck in rigid patterns. That's the opposite of freedom. That's the prison house closing on the on the growing boy, as Wordsworth would say. That's constraint. Whereas return to wellness is a rediscovery of freedom, of options. I could do this, I could do that. I'm not a slave to my anorexia or my depression or my addiction. So freedom and wellness are very close.
But doesn't, again, not to go too deep into the free will rabbit hole again, but doesn't that also become, like, once you have a new order of beliefs and you optimize and isn't there like a new form of potential psychological automation where once you have the new beliefs and they're working well for you, like, I'm just bouncing around, I'm making new friends, great relationships. And could there be a sense of automaticity there where now there's more of an autopilot and there's less of a need to sort of critically question this belief and that belief, and there's just, you kind of settle into a new groove of patterning and it's working well for you?
Yeah, but that automaticity is also kind of like mindfulness, is just going with the flow. And we're always moving. There's always movement. It's just movement with greater freedom now, greater spontaneity. So you could call it automaticity, but it is like sort of a free movement.
So it's not just that you have new beliefs that are serving you well. It's also
maybe happen. I would say, but the Buddha said, go back to very early things that the Buddha probably said, and he kept going on about, don't believe me. beware of beliefs, he was saying.
Mm.
They're enslaving, they're constraining. Let
Mm.
go of beliefs.
Wow.
It's tied
Yeah.
up with the whole thing, like let go of attachment. That's the road to suffering. Uh, don't
Mm.
believe anything too strongly. Don't believe in magic mushrooms too strongly. You know,
Yeah.
don't believe in the entropic brain too strongly, or rebus, or hold all beliefs, all assumptions lightly, um, because otherwise you can get too attached. Yeah, and that
So
can
you so
lead to
you're
suffering.
saying that there could be a new order of beliefs that are healthy in sort of people who are recovering from mental illness, but it's not just an automation of healthy beliefs, but maybe also a freedom, and awareness and a mindfulness
Yeah,
of
and a,
what
and a
beliefs.
lightness, like a lightness of touch, in a sense. So you might think you might start to develop a belief around healthy eating, but is that a belief in the same way that you need to be chronically underweight to control your life, to get emotional control? Is the belief that healthy eating is good for me? Is that really? Can you really compare the two? And I would say that healthy eating is good for me is probably a light touch belief, whereas that fierce I must control the calories I consume to stay this particular very low weight is a different kind of beliefs. It's like pathological by being, yes, overweighted, held very
Mm.
tightly, and being at odds with consensus values.
Mm.
Like, your loved ones don't believe that, and most of society don't believe that it's good that you're so
Mm.
chronically dangerously underweight. So those are two components. The light beliefs, there's a story of the Buddha going for dinner. I think he's sort of, doing his thing, meandering around, asking for food probably. And he gets invited in, and at this time he's decided he's not going to eat meat because that doesn't sit well with him, in terms of compassion for fellow sentient beings. And yet he sits down at the table and there's like a big hog roast or something. And
Mm.
he keeps his mouth shut, as in he doesn't say anything, and he partakes and has a nice dinner. I love that story because it's like he wasn't so, even if it's just a myth, it probably is. It's saying be flexible, even if you think you have a noble value and belief in this context, lighten it a bit, because actually the nobler thing is to
Mm.
enjoy this, meal that these kind people
Mm.
have put in front of you. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. This is so fascinating. Because the like, do you not think that you could also have a strong belief system that is positive too? Right. So say in the anorexia example, like maybe coming to a belief that I don't need to lose weight to feel emotional or life satisfaction, or say people who are moving from, which I'm working on, moving from scarcity mentality to an abundance mentality. Can't you also have a very strong positive, oh, life is abundant, love is abundant, friendships are abundant, instead of the opposite, which is toxic?
Yeah, I think the middle way sort of wisdom of Buddhism might come in, where yeah, sure, but like don't grasp it too tightly. Like everything in moderation. That sounds like a good way to feel about things,
Mm-hmm.
but try not to fall into a trap of like grasping that new belief. Like, now I've found the thing that'll save me, and then you realize over time that you've, like, take like exercise for example. Oh, now I've found exercise and how healthy it is, and I feel fantastic and I look better, and then before you know it, you're like exercising excessively and causing injury, and like
Mm-hmm.
you're really grasping, I need to exercise every day, every moment, and it becomes
Right.
actually pathological, or you get into like steroids and bodybuilding, and it went from a thing that was healthy to an overshoot that is now looking to most people as an unhealthy thing. Yeah.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Before we go, I had two reader questions. And you already talked about anorexia. A reader of mine, Chris Hamilton, she asked, can psychedelics help with eating disorders? And then Rosie asked, is there any research for Parkinson's being helped with microdosing psychedelics? We can end with that. Can you just spend, I know we're way over time, but can you just spend just a couple minutes? You mentioned anorexia. Is that your particular work on it? And can you just describe what the work is on anorexia and what efficacy you're finding with psychedelics?
Yeah, I'm part of a team. I raised the money for the research and helped design it. But Meg Spriggs, Hannah Douglas, Kate Godfrey, David Nutt, David Arizzo, so many great people. Rebecca Park, Jen Danby. I mean, heroes throughout. And so it's a team effort. Yeah, we did a trial of psilocybin therapy for anorexia.
When was this?
It was finished a couple of years ago, in a sense, or close to being finished, and it's being ready for a top journal, Lancet Psychiatry. So let's see. But
it's not published yet.
No, but it's not far away.
Okay. That's why I didn't hear much about it yet. Okay.
Yeah, it's a really good paper, really good work, and it will go to a top journal. Let's see what they say about it. It looks very good. In the design, it's not super clear what got people better, but we've got insight about that coming. I do think the psilocybin matters.
Psilocybin plus psychotherapy.
Yeah, and others think maybe the psychotherapy was doing it all. I'm a little skeptical of that view of things. I don't really think that we would have seen the quality of improvements that we saw without the psilocybin on board.
Was it 2 sessions or 1 session of psilocybin?
It was actually 3, and the first session was a very low dose. It was only 1 milligram, which is a placebo dose.
Oh, okay.
So the talking therapy really kicked in at that point because people came expecting to trip. People who control things very fiercely came in expecting to trip, didn't. So they would talk a lot and develop good therapeutic alliance. And they started to improve because of that. But then the trajectory continued and they improved. And I think it was 50% remission at 3 months. I don't want to get that wrong, but it's in that ballpark. That might not sound that fantastic, but it's pretty good for adult. Like these were sort of mid-30s, so kind of older anorexia. Treatment resistant because they're that old,
Really?
That old. Yeah, I mean, it's not old, but it's older than being a teenage girl, for example.
So is it mostly women, or is it men and
women?
All
women in this trial. That was
all women.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I would have had men in the trial, but others argued that it might make more sense, just for clarity, to have a more homogeneous sample by sex,
right.
At least.
Yeah. Women predominantly suffer from that.
They do. So it's representative. Yeah. So I understand. I think that's
So 50% remission rate, roughly.
Yes. So then, that's pretty good because they don't have anorexia anymore, and they've had it usually since they were a teenager into their mid-30s on average.
And versus placebo?
So it was a single-arm design that went placebo 25-25. So this is where we can't say with confidence what got them better.
Oh, I see. You didn't compare it to...
Might lead you to think psilocybin played some role, but it's hard in this design to say how much. And that's just where we are. But that's what you do sometimes. You do a study, it gets the intrigue going. Colleagues have done work here at UCSF in Parkinson's disease, similar kind of design, open label. They see improvements in mood, some improvement in motor symptoms. Don't know if that's psilocybin doing it or expectation or what, or the mood, and then the motor function being secondary to mood improvements. So we're often left with more questions than when we started, but we're always learning. We're always deepening the understanding. Even if we have more questions, we're learning and advancing for sure.
Yeah. So with the anorexia, you were talking about thought beliefs being loosened.
Yeah, that'll come. I mean, those results are fantastic. We also saw it in chronic pain that problematic beliefs, pathological beliefs, are really sensitive to change with psilocybin, not sensitive to change with placebo. So you're always looking for that kind of holy.
That is so
It's cool, isn't
fascinating.
it?
I love that.
Yeah, I think it could be at the core of things. NIMH wanted a biomarker, the target for all these different categories of illness. What we might actually find here is a target that covers a bunch of illnesses. And is it a biological target? I think it's a biological and psychological. We measure it principally in the psychological domain. We literally ask people to rate how confident they are in these beliefs.
Wow.
From like absolute certainty to I just came up with anything randomly, don't believe it at all, really. But you introduce the psilocybin drops towards the end of the trip. In the afterglow, we ask them to rate it, and then over time as well, and
Really?
even quite far out, over a month, say, then
Wow.
they're not believing this thing anymore. Yeah.
And then do you identify like a handful set of beliefs? Like you ask them, or find out what the core 5 toxic beliefs are? Or
yeah, there's like an interview process that gets them to dial in. You can imagine that it's quite upsetting and quite agitating to be sort of guided towards these really tragic and painful beliefs, and there's a lot of tears and so on. So there's a process.
So you identify their beliefs. They tell
yeah,
you.
That's right.
And is it multiple beliefs, or are you just interviewing them on one belief after 1 month or 3 weeks after?
Yeah, we categorize beliefs. And so in anorexia, we had like ego-syntonic ones, ways in which the anorexia serves you, but also like negative beliefs, like I'm worthless is different. That's more sort of ego-dystonic, something that you don't want to believe, but you still do. Or you don't want, rather, but you still believe it. Because the ego-syntonic
versus the other one. What's the other one?
The other ones are stuff that in a sense you're ambivalent would be the fairer thing to say about whether you want that thing or not. Like, so the anorexia makes me more popular or more attractive, and they believe that thing. And you say, "Oh, you really believe this?" Yeah, I do. And like on the face of it, can you say that's negative? Well, they're saying it's doing something for them. It's like functional for them in some way. And actually in the anorexia, that might be most at the core of the problem. And it speaks to the classic ambivalence in anorexia. Like, do you really want to get better? Because people are terrified of not having the anorexia.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, you don't really get that in depression, do you? You want rid of that awful,
right.
Black dog, as Churchill described it, I think.
Don't people want to get better of anorexia overwhelmingly?
There's ambivalence. I mean, their loved ones want them to get better.
Oh, really? Oh, okay.
Yeah, I mean, this is an example of, they can be like, I'm conflicted, because it gives them something, it gives them control.
Wow.
Gives them can kind of numb them.
Versus the negative belief, like I'm worthless, I don't deserve love.
Yeah, that's often there as well. I mean, that speaks to the paradox. That's there too. But in the worthlessness and the emotional turmoil, the anorexia gives them regularity, and that's a common theme in psychopathology. In the turmoil of this shitty life that I've had, the methamphetamine gives me regularity, gives me confidence, lets me socialize a bit, maybe even say have sexual relations, wouldn't ordinarily, but I'll do that on methamphetamine, Let's say it's prostitutes say, that they would, that's where they would have the sex would be under the influence of the meth. You could see these patterns.
Right. Or like I feel really alive when I'm doing this gambling.
I can function. Yeah, it's like self-medication. I can function now, and when you withdraw, you're just flat, And so it's almost like it's so tragic, but now I'm functioning and living. That's the entrapment, the enslavement of, say, hard drug addiction. I mean, all these, we're really dialing in on some of the worst now. The most deadly ones, hard drug addiction.
Are there other examples too? We mentioned anorexia, addiction, where there's more of an ambivalence towards the psychopathology?
Some would say it's often there. Even in depression, do they really want to get better? In treatment resistant depression, that's a weird thing to say, but like, how is the depression functioning? You've had it all of your life. Like, does it give you any kind of safety? Is it like a way
Mm,
to hide away from the world, to retreat into your shell like a turtle? Um,
right. Maybe gives you an explanation for why you're not making new friends or why you're not
yeah,
experiencing
yeah.
more positive emotions. Like, oh, because, or, maybe someone might say, oh, because I'm depressed, or, oh, because life is hopeless. That's your belief, or your belief is
There's no
I'm
point.
unworthy. Oh, the
Yeah,
reason why I'm not able to find a relationship or I'm not able to find happiness is because I'm unworthy.
yeah, yeah. There you go. And then it's giving, in that sort of weird paradoxical way, it's giving you some confidence when otherwise you're just swimming in uncertainty, and that's very difficult to tolerate.
Yeah.
Yeah, I tend to think that's the formula by which mental illness forms. It's like
The toxic
it's an
beliefs.
yeah, and an attempt to find order, even if it's a problematic order. Um,
Oh, okay. So right, you're struggling. You have trauma, or you've been through some hard times. Let's create a belief system to make sense of that. Oh,
yeah,
the reason why this happened is because I'm unworthy. Oh, the reason why this happened is because of X, Y, or Z.
yeah, and sometimes it's as literal as a belief system, and sometimes it's vaguer. The belief can get like instantiated into behavioral habit or even physiological habit, craving in drug withdrawal. Like, I need this thing. Like, I need this thing. Literally, to survive, to live, I
Yeah.
need this thing. So is that a belief system? Kinda. It's just like really deeply ingrained into like physiology and
Right.
behavior and, yeah, impulse and instinct. I mean, one great outcome with the psychedelic therapy, if you think of the ideal scenario, treating a hard stamped in drug addiction with a psychedelic, is that they think, I don't need it. I don't need that thing. I really thought I needed it. I can let it go. I don't need alcohol, say. I mean, that's the ideal, but that's the ideal that,
Mm.
that's a possibility. Yeah.
Mm. Mm. Right. Yeah. Yeah. And then the changing of those belief systems. That's really yeah. And oh yeah, what I was gonna say was most people don't know they have a belief system, but they do. That's the thing. Like
Yeah.
people who are depressed, it's like you actually have a very rigid orderliness to your thoughts. It doesn't feel that way because there's the kind of depression feels, and I've experienced symptoms years ago. It feels very gloomy. There's like a lack of structure. It feels like it. There feels like an emptiness to reality, a grayness, a kind of wasting away. But there's an order within that most people
Yeah.
within when they're in there, like I was years ago, you don't actually realize that there's an orderliness to your belief system.
There is. I mean, a funny one, it's not that funny, but a classic one is not showing up. You don't leave your bedroom, you don't leave your bed. That's a highly predictable behavior, is that you've gone sedentary and you're just not getting out. And people have found this with, like, behavioral tracking through wearables and, Apple Watches and that kind of thing, is that people communicate less and they just move less in a depression. Their language is different as well. So they actually move towards predictability without realizing it. I
Mm.
mean, we're slaves. We're
Creatures of habit.
we are creatures of habit, and we're blind to it. We're blinkered to it. Even healthy people, and it's just that thing becomes exaggerated, I think, in mental illness. The
Right.
blind spot.
And then
Yeah,
circling back in the your entropic brain hypothesis, you're adding a level of chaos and disorder to start shaking those rigid beliefs and then creating new beliefs. But like I was saying earlier, but the goal is to get to new habits that are healthy, right? New habits of
I'm not
thought.
sure I would go too hard on that. I would
No?
just say, much of it is unlearning. Much of it is unlearning, resetting,
Yeah.
recalibration. Uh, I wouldn't say you want to jump too readily from bad belief to good belief, because what
Really?
is good belief? Just because that good belief could then become a defense mechanism in its own right. Um, if held too lightly, if grasped too tightly, like I've got to exercise all the time, or I've got to become a Superman by doing all
But what
these.
about like I am worthy. I do love myself.
Yeah, it's good. It's great. You don't want to hold that too tightly, though. You know, as in, I am amazing. It's
Well,
attract.
okay.
You
Well,
could
that's
say,
ego then. Yeah, I would
yeah,
differentiate
it's
that.
attracted like a narcissism. Yeah. So
But I
yeah,
am
I do
worthy.
think.
I feel like you should strongly hold to that belief that you are worthy. No?
Yeah, but you don't want to push it so far that you're more worthy than another. For example, um,
Okay.
we
Okay.
did
Yeah. Fair enough. Yeah.
once upon a time we did a measure of ego dissolution and ego inflation, and the ego dissolution inventory became a measure that people still use today in different studies, meditation, 5-MeO. The ego inflation one people thought was funny, but kind of let go of. And it had items like, I feel my opinions are more important than other people's, and like
Mm,
stuff that you just like, whoa, like, I hope no one believes that. Um,
right.
and we asked people to rate it in relation to cocaine use, and we found that very dose dependently people moved up that ego inflation scale in relation to the
Yeah.
dosage of cocaine that they'd taken. So I guess you don't want to be too confident and too self absorbed, such that you move
Right.
up that ego inflation dimension. So back to that point of beware of beliefs, middle way, moderation, hold it lightly. Even the healthy beliefs, like there would be a way to overshoot on them.
Right. Or like a
Maybe
belief like
there are.
or a belief like I am lovable, right? Instead of I'm not
That's
lovable.
pretty good, isn't it? Yeah, but you don't want to overshoot it into narcissism. Like, I'm so
Yeah. Sure.
freaking lovable. Everyone loves me, you know. So yeah, I know
Right.
I'm
Yeah. Okay.
playing.
I understand what you're saying.
Yeah,
Yeah, but so you would characterize more the adding the entropy in the psychedelic state. You're unlearning the toxic beliefs, but you would not emphasize as much like of learning new healthy beliefs, but that is part of it, right?
all in good time. The wise people would say, cultivate your soil and your garden, and it's don't rush that job. Slowly, cultivate good conditions. Um, yeah, I just go to people like Jack Cornfield and Thich Nhat Hanh and the wise old Buddhists who would say, go slowly, slow down, cultivate good, without question, cultivate good, but go slow, go gentle with that. Yeah.
Right, but that is part of the recovery that you see in your studies, right? People with depression or anorexia or whatever, they have the toxic beliefs, and it's unlearning those beliefs. But we are humans; we need beliefs, and so you have to replace it with something, right? And it should be healthier beliefs if you want
I
to get
think
out of.
that's a fascinating question. What is it to not hold beliefs generally too strongly? That some people might say that's starting to sound like some kind of weird nihilism. Um, Maybe.
Well,
I do think
yeah,
it's possible to be very flexible with your beliefs, say political beliefs, religious beliefs.
right.
Um, yeah,
I'm
it,
asking particularly in the trial participants in your studies, right? They're unlearning toxic
yeah.
depressive thought patterns versus
Well,
how do you
there's a
you got to
great
replace the
paper.
depressive thought patterns with
Yeah,
new thought patterns, right?
all in good time, but we don't input them. We don't, at least consciously, and I don't think my colleagues do this. We don't try to belief transfer, like teach them new
Yeah,
things.
yeah, of course. They have to
We
realize it
don't
on their own.
really. Yeah, and then they're more likely to stick. So it's more about questioning and unlearning the problematic beliefs, than trying to jump from bad belief to good belief. That now we've got to train you up on good belief.
Right.
That has actually been questioned. I was going to mention a paper, a colleague of mine, some colleagues, Chris Timmerman, David Dupuy, Rosalind Watts wrote a paper on like a light touch, a gentle touch by a facilitator, a guide, a sitter in psychedelic therapy.
Yeah.
And my reading of that is that it's saying don't beware of belief transfer.
Yeah.
Beware of trying to like impart your beliefs onto another.
Yeah, absolutely. But again, is it not a critical part for the individual doing the psychedelics for them to find their new beliefs to override or replace the toxic, depressive beliefs or
Possibly,
anorexic?
yeah. I mean, one of the things that can happen after a psychedelic experience is you don't know what's real anymore. So there's a derealization. I
Yeah.
don't know what I can believe anymore. Is this real? You know, like the airline pilot who pulled the cord. Apparently he was in a state of derealization. He was like, I could pull this and it's not going to matter. Oh no, it's really going to matter. You could cause a tragedy by doing that. So there can be a dangerous lightness of belief that manifests as a sort of derealization. You might say a depersonalization. I don't know whether I'm real anymore, or I can't, actually John Lennon, you could look up talking about him struggling with LSD-induced ego dissolution. And then he just didn't know what to believe anymore. And it put him into a dark place for a while. So it's a thing, So yeah, I think that's why the integration work, the being mindful and aware, both you as someone coming into a psychedelic experience, but also psychedelic practitioners need to know if they're new to the business, so to speak, need to know what they're signing up for. As in, you could destabilize someone. Are you going to stick around for them? Are you going to stick around to help them integrate? Because if you aren't, maybe you shouldn't have signed up to this. You're taking on quite a responsibility here. So
I'm just incredibly aware how our belief systems and our thought patterns impact our behavior, right? And when it comes to healthier behaviors, even too, right? How we treat other people, how we treat ourselves, they're based on our belief systems. And speaking from my own MDMA experiences, sometimes it's taken time, sometimes it's more immediate. Where it's like in my last MDMA trip last year, I was highly prioritizing goal setting over enjoying life, and I was always setting goals, more articles, more pot, and not actually enjoying life. And I'm like, oh my god, I haven't even enjoyed the last 3 years, with some rare exceptions, and I'm just prioritizing goals. And so the new belief system was that I'm still working on and integrating, as you do, is the present moment is incredibly important. The present moment needs to be enjoyed. And to your point, obviously, you still need goals, right? You need to set goals and put things on the calendar and set goals on a daily or weekly basis. But that changing that belief system to, it's not about. Previously, I was believing, implicitly, unconsciously, whatever, that life was about achieving goals, always setting bigger goals. But then the trip made me realize, like, is that really what life is about, or is life about enjoying the process, enjoying the day to day, instead of waiting to finish the book, finish the podcast, and then enjoying life? So that's a big shift in narrative, right?
It is absolutely. It's a really good one. I said freedom and wellness are close. I lost my train of thought. There was one other component that I thought of that is now fell out of my head. The critical moment.
Freedom, changing thought patterns, changing your narrative, changing your belief system.
Gratitude. It's gratitude. I think gratitude it's different but related. It's another factor to bring in. I think, they talk about counting your blessings. I think there's something very close to wellness and happiness and joy in gratitude. It sort of has a causal power to lift that thing up. We lost Amanda Fielding recently. I was thinking about it. I was driving along the freeway, and I was like, that I was pretty close with Amanda, and we would talk about all sorts of things, and now she's gone. Like, that's kind of abstract. And then it just made me realize that I was alive, and then I was like grateful that I was alive. And I was like, when you know you're going to die and you really know that, that it's easier, I think, to feel gratitude for being alive. And that was one of the meditations of the Buddha, I think, and it's in Buddhism, these 5 remembrances, and they're kind of related to demise, loss. And many people think, why are you meditating on such depressing things? But the
Yeah.
irony is, by realizing these
Makes you more
fundamental
grateful.
truths, makes you more grateful. Yeah.
And for those around you, because they're going to die too one day.
And for those, that's one of the remembrances, is that they're going to die too, and so your heart's breaking, and then it ends with, but all I have is this moment. Yeah. And
that's a new belief system. That's a new belief.
Yeah, you could, or a realization. Is it a belief? Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Maybe. Yeah.
Yeah. Again, I'm just emphasizing that belief thing because, again, like that MDMA trip example that I gave to you, right? And this is, we'll table this for another podcast too, about integration, but like, it's like a perpetually, for me, it's like a returning to that. And sometimes it's like, it's been a few months since the trip, kind of going back to old patterns. And then you go back to the trip notes from the therapist. It's like, oh, right. Yeah. I do remember the realization I had was, you need to prioritize enjoying the present moment. And then there's remembering that more and more till it becomes more of a habit, right? Of, present moment, focus on the present moment. Don't overemphasize the goals. And so then you want to entrench that into an orderly belief system so that you don't get lost again and forget about the present moment.
Yeah. You want to cue yourself when you forget. Yeah. I think I said, you realize the final remembrance is all you have is this moment. I think actually it's all I have, or we have, are our actions, what we can do in this world when alive. So that's beautiful also, I think. You sort of run through these things and you're like, but I'm alive and I can do stuff. And now what are you going to do with that power? It's quite liberating, yeah.
Wow. The anorexia work you mentioned, when is that going to be out?
Well, give it a few months. Watch out. Hopefully the Lancet Psychiatry will publish it. They published our depression work back in 2016 and it did very well.
Okay.
So it's very high quality work, I can say that. I mean, that sounds like I'm patting myself on the back. Really, it's patting others on the back because they did the majority, really, of the hard work. So it's very good. Give it a few months, and it's a very mature report as well. It doesn't try and oversell; it just tells it as it is. It doesn't say we've got the answer now. It says maybe there's something here. So it's good, I think.
Right, and that's the same study that you were talking about. We're rating the belief systems, rating the beliefs.
That's going to have to be another paper because it's another. Yeah, it's another measure. It often happens that you've got a bunch of measures, and they're all kind of complementary angles. There are word counts in these journals, especially the top ones. So you can only say so much. And actually, we've got pages and pages in a supplementary appendix.
Really?
Sometimes you've got really novel measures that it just makes good sense to hold back for its own publication so that people can see those findings spotlighted. So that'll be another paper.
Okay. And when will that be out? Will that be out after that one?
I'd give that a few months too. Timing wise, it probably will be after. There's a lot to come. We've got fibromyalgia syndrome trial being written up now.
Yeah.
We're doing the set and setting work. We've done this deep dive on psychedelic substates, collecting 15 hours of brain imaging data per participant. 15 hours, 12 of those hours under the influence of psilocybin, magic mushrooms. So that's a unique data set. So
looking at what are you finding? Like, is there new findings beyond default mode network and entropy?
We're working on it. There's a lot of replication so far, but chipping away all the time, and it depends on asking new questions to get new answers. And so far, we've mostly been asking kind of questions that we, dare I say, already know the answer to. So I'm nudging my colleagues to start asking those new questions. I'd love to capture why psychedelics are psychedelic. I've recently done a paper that's shown that they are validly psychedelics, psyche illuminating. They promote psychological insight. think there's a growing consensus about that. But I've shown that classic psychedelics like psilocybin do that as their main thing, like that's their principal component. And I compare classic psychedelics to MDMA and ketamine, where sure they can do that, but as their main thing, MDMA seems to promote feelings of love and pro-sociality, and that's its main thing. And for ketamine, sure, it can be a psychedelic, but its main thing is dissociation. That's its main thing.
Versus psilocybin.
Psychological insight, seeing visions, seeing things, that's seeing into the mind, but also literally, I can see more deeply into my mind.
No, which is the same as MDMA.
MDMA was feelings of love as its main action.
Okay, but I mean, MDMA also is very powerful at seeing things more clearly within yourself.
Yeah. It's just in that study, it didn't come out as its main thing.
Okay.
I mean, it's just that the data fell in a way that the main property of MDMA was feelings of love. That was top.
Yeah.
And wanting to be closer to others. Some of these drugs, as a colleague of mine says, they're chameleons, meaning, in a sense, their action or their effects are very context dependent. I mean, that's true for all of them. And so you can, in the context of psychotherapy, MDMA-assisted psychotherapy, you can shape that compound to be more psychedelic as well. Yeah, you can.
Yeah. My psychedelic therapist, they referred to my last MDMA trip last January as very psilocybin-like. Like, there was a lot of deep revelations, and I'm going back in July 11th is my next MDMA therapy session, just continuing the journey and trying to understand myself. So it's so beautiful, like this work, like, doing it, talking about it, having this conversation is just incredible. So I really thank you for what you're doing, and this conversation was incredibly fascinating and exceeded my already high expectations for what this was going to be. Just building on some of those things you talked about with Peterson and Huberman. I'm really glad we went deep into some of these areas, hit all these different disciplines, and yet there still are like 20 more questions, but we can do that again one day.
We've covered a lot, haven't we? Yeah, it's been a real pleasure. Yeah, thank you for having me on, and it's been fun. Yeah.
We'll circle back. Maybe I want to know about when that study comes out on the changing beliefs. That's really fascinating. I'll try to watch out for that. Feel free to ping me whenever that comes out too, if you happen to remember. I'd love to read it.
What I can say is that I've got a website. On the website, people could subscribe to a newsletter. So every month,
oh, fantastic!
I pump out news on studies that are coming, news on research that's happening here, and the book as well. You can hear news about how to pre-order it. So it's Carhart-Harris.com. And on the landing page, you can subscribe, and that's how you can track.
We'll link to that below, and we definitely need a lot more high quality science psychedelic information sources. We need a lot more. Like there's a lot of psychedelic journalism, but like actual coverage and analysis of what's new studies, new reports from actual researchers like yourself and Matt, I think is really important. And I've talked to Matt about that there should be like a psychedelic researcher podcast, and I want to talk to Huberman about that too, because Huberman has like the Psychom Media now, where he got Andy Galpin to do just a podcast on just fitness, and like I feel like a podcast just on psychedelic science findings with clinicians or researchers like yourself. I feel like we need that. I don't know if that's something you would do, or I know Matt would do that, but
think about it. Yeah, I do think there's value there. Yeah, I think that could be very popular.
Yeah.
And so many things to do.
So many things. Yeah. And you sort of alluded to this, but research reader was asking on research for Parkinson's being helped with microdosing. Do you know anything about that?
I'm not sure I've heard anything with microdosing. I've heard about a study with macrodosing by colleagues just over the way here at UCSF.
Is that published?
So that's published now. Yeah, I think Ellen Bradley, first author, Josh Woolley, senior author. Balazs Sigeti's on there of microdosing fame. He did a classic paper on microdosing. So folks should check that out. It's a really interesting study.
Positive findings?
Yeah, yeah, very impressive. It's a modest design, open label, but that's how we begin, and it gets the ball rolling. So, yeah, there's something to watch there.
Wow. Incredible. All right. Thank you so much for your time. This was amazing. This will go out in a few days, and we'll see you at the MAPS conference next week.
See you in Denver. Yeah,
Yeah,
thanks,
that'd be
Ralph.
a lot
It's
of
been a
fun.
pleasure. Take care.